Before we start, here is an image of the finished model, a little zoom of the stern of her. And do note the 10mm scale at the bottom. This is a 1/700th scale model, and it's quite small when completed. And note also to the left the diminutive crew figures on top of the hangar and the Sea Cat missiles in front of the hangar. That gives you an idea of the sort of scale that we're working at. So, counter-class destroyers. The 8 counter-class destroyers became the platform for the first generation anti-aircraft guided missile, Sea Slug, which was being introduced into the Royal Navy service in the 1960s. These ships were large, partly to accommodate the unwieldy missiles, but also to provide command facilities, as these destroyers were starting to replace the cruiser in the modern Royal Navy fleet. Sea Slug was a very, very large missile. It was launched from a huge trainable latticework launcher at the stern of the ship. And the Sea Slug development program took many years through the 1950s and into the early 60s, with initial sea trials on HMS Girdle-Ness before installation on the county-class destroyers. And the red shaded area on this image here shows the portion of the ship taken up with all the mechanics and the handling machinery and the launch and the guidance radar associated with Sea Slug. So you can see that the ship was basically built around the requirements of Sea Slug itself. Missile components started at the fore ends and were gradually assembled and checked out as they made their way aft towards the launcher. Initially, only 24 missiles could be carried in the magazine because it was so large. And note on this ship here that all the missile space is above the waterline. It was not practical to place the missiles in a more protected, deeper space within the ship itself. And the counter-class were produced in 2 batches of 4 ships. The first batch of ships, Devonshire, Hampshire, Kent and London, had some quite significant differences in detail between them. The second batch were very much of a similar nature, but they had improved equipment. They had a double bedstead main radar rather than a single antenna, and they were virtually identical to each other. And the latter 4 were later fitted with quad Exocet missiles instead of the B turret, as there was a move towards guided missiles for anti-surface work as well as anti-air work. And they also had an improved version of Sea Slug. But coming back to the first batch of ships, one of those, HMS Hampshire, was commanded by Ian McLaughlin's uncle in the late 60s. And Ian has commissioned a model of the vessel set around 1967 when his uncle was in command. And after discussion, we decided that 1/700th scale was the preferred scale to keep the model size manageable. The model is about 9 inches long at that scale. And the model was to be shown moored on a calm sea base as if it's in Portsmouth. We had to talk about how to make that sea base a few months ago. The baseline kit, which I used, was the HMS Kent model from Starling. Starling produce some very nice resin and 3D printed kits at the moment. They're concentrating on post-World War II and latter part of World War II Royal Navy vessels, in 700 scale in particular, but also some 350th scale models. The kit here had a resin hull, 3D printed superstructure and details, and a large sheet of photo etch parts, which obviously needed to be folded and attached appropriately. Now, construction of Kent out of the box would be fairly straightforward, and I've made one of their models before, though there were some mismatches between the printed instructions and the actual parts, but there was nothing that really taxed a competent modeler. However, Hampshire was somewhat different to Kent and needed some alterations. The main differences visually between Kent and Hampshire were reshaping and repositioning of the main mast from the after superstructure block to the forward block, adaptation of the 2 superstructure blocks to accommodate that change, repositioning of the ship's boats and davits on the port side, replacement of 2 of the fire control stations, which were slightly later versions in HMS Kent, and I had to revert back to an earlier close-range blind fire director version on HMS Hampshire, just by scratch building those. And of course, decals had to be revised because the pennant number and the ship's name were different. There were also some embellishments to add on top of the out-of-the-box kit. I used brass main gun barrels to replace the supplied resin versions. The resin ones were very, very fragile and probably wouldn't stand much handling. And I added numerous crew around the ship, and these were aftermarket crew from Starling again. And the captain's Land Rover parked alongside the hangar, as was the custom with many of these county-class destroyers. So just showing a couple of the alterations on the left there. At the top, you've got the configuration as it would be in HMS Kent, and at the bottom you can see the mast has shifted to the forward superstructure block while HMS Hampshire was being constructed, and a bit of reshaping was required as well. And on the right-hand side, there's a little image from a manual of a close-range blind fire director. It was basically a small cylinder with a pram-type hood over the top. So I constructed those out of plastic rod and plastic card. You can see the various parts as I was beginning to build the ship. A little bit of painting going on. The four ends of these county-class destroyers had wooden decks still. They're probably one of the last ships in the Royal Navy to have wooden decks, at least for parts of the structure. Lots of 3D printed elements, lots of photo etch. I managed to get a little bit of a hint of hull plating by using my usual technique of strips of masking tape and then painting over those to give a little bit of seepage between the gaps between the tape to give a tiny indication of hull plating. And on the right there, you can see some of the images while the ship was being put together, a little bit of weathering. The counter-class destroyers were often used to go around the world and fly the flag in the same way that cruisers used to. So they were often kept up in good condition, and you'd only get a little bit of weathering on the ships. They were kept well painted. I'm sure certainly under Captain McLaughlin's eagle eye. Finishing off, there were about 3 dozen crew figures which we dotted around the deck just to give a good indication of the ship that was busy as it was being finally moored in harbour. And we created the waterscape using Ian's acrylic paint, mottled underlay, overlaid with a clear acrylic ripple sheeting. And this, as we saw in an earlier talk, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, you get changes with the light in the background with reflections off the plastic sheet. And here are some examples of different lighting conditions with exactly the same model, which is quite a nice effect. So lighting effects, it looks rather nice, and you can see the base there that Ian constructed, which I placed the ship on with its mooring buoys. The final model was set in an acrylic case, purchased from Displays UK. We moored the ship fore and aft, and a little bit of a close-up of the after mooring there. You can see the finished model. I had to redo the decals. For some reason, Starling provided the name of the ship in black, whereas the names of most Starling ships on the nameplate is done in red. So that had to be hand printed. And I used a little bit of AK Interactive water foam to indicate a little bit of movement in the water there, a few bubbles and little bits of foam. And of course, there's the helicopter on deck as well, just being looked at before the ship is finally moored. I think they're having trouble with the rotor blades then. Another picture of the stern of the ship. You can see the Land Rover parked on the non-opening side of the hangar. And note also the reflections on the hull there from the waterscape. And then the final top view of the ship as it sits in its case. For those who like enumerating all the equipment on board ship, I produced a guide for Ian so he can show people the various features on the ship when he's displaying his model. Clearly, going from fore to aft, you've got the twin 4.5-inch guns in those 2 turrets. You've got the bridge, you've got a medium-range fire director above the bridge, various radars, chaff launchers, you've got some electronic countermeasures jammers on the main mast, the close-range blind fire directors, as I mentioned earlier, just after the after funnel. You've got the 901 guidance radar, which guides the Sea Slug missile, which is just after the hangar. The hangar is a bit of an unusual one in this counter-class destroyers. It opens sideways rather than sternwise, which made manoeuvring the helicopter out of the hangar past the Seacat launcher really quite difficult and awkward. It echoes perhaps of Paul's talk a little bit later on. The Wessex helicopter on the helicopter deck, and then finally the twin Sea Slug launcher at the stern there. And the modelling effects, there was light weathering with a little bit of plating and oil canning to give it a little bit of life. And here we have a picture which Ian and Mike Heath worked on. This is a picture of the model at sea. using one of the AI tools that Mike has at his disposal, which looks rather nice. And then future work. Model turned out quite nicely. Starling models are high precision and they're nice to work with. And Captain Ian D. McLaughlin's commands included HMS Flint Castle, which was a Castle-class frigate, HMS Concord, which he commanded during the Korean War, 2 more Sea-class destroyers, Chieftain and Chevron, and then later as Captain 2nd Frigate Squadron at Portland, he was in command of Whirlwind and Undaunted, that were Type 15 frigate conversions from earlier World War II destroyers. And what we will do over the next few months is build up a Flint Castle, Concord and Whirlwind to the same scale as Hampshire, and then they will join Hampshire in a single large moored setting representative of Portsmouth Harbour as a memento of Captain McLaughlin's commands. And then just a note about model sources. As I mentioned, Starling models, they're becoming one of the best sources for small-scale R&D ships in the Cold War. And the models are usually resin, 3D printed and photo etch. And the photo etch is pre-scored very nicely in the appropriate places. So it's quite easy to work with. And they also produce a good selection of aftermarket accessories if you want to buy weapons, antennas, various other parts that go on small-scale ships, particularly for scratch building. They're quite useful accessories. And Starling have just released a CA-class destroyer and will soon produce Type 15 frigates, which is just right for this modelling task. The Castle-class corvette, which Starling don't produce in 1/700 scale, is already produced by Triumph Models in China, and we'll be using that one as a base model. And that's the end of the show. So thank you, everyone.